Speaking of our Discord, here is a question from our Discord. From a developer's perspective and from his own, it sounds as if he's traveled quite a bit and talked to a diverse amount of devs in varying regions. So anything interesting or difference in approach towards developing a game in general, game development style in other regions, US, EU, Asia, etc. All right, so first, yeah, I traveled a bunch and also had a bunch of people visit. When you were a developer and you were visiting from Valve, almost always I gave you the tour while I was there, partially because I like to do that. And I like to then, at the end of the tour, in those offices, we would go through everything, and then we'd go up to the sound room, and then we'd go to the private sound room, which is where we did voice recording and other things. And that was an entirely soundproof room that everybody knew was entirely private. And I would ask them questions then, like, how do you do compensation? How do you do bonuses? How do you give people raises? How do you determine raises? How do you determine firing people? And have honest, real conversations about these things. I did that a lot. I think people were kind of surprised sometimes, and then sometimes like, yeah, let's talk about this, because I know Valve does it, and I would be very honest of how we do it, and then the pluses and minuses there. And I was just trying to learn of how to make it better. Later, when I went and I gave a roundtable at DICE, I actually had people like Vince Zampinelli and Randy Pritchford in my roundtable talking about this as well from their companies and their perspective. They're both, I know people like to beat up on developers these days, but I like both of those men a great deal, and they've always been super generous with me, where I could ask them like hard questions and they will stop everything and answer them for me, and I super appreciate that. Consider them both like, yeah, they're both great. But so yeah, so I've done that. I've gone to Ubisoft studios around the world. I've gone to like EA studios. I've gone to Chinese developers. I've gone to people squatting in apartments in Ukraine where they're kind of running their business out of a person's personal apartment. I've gone to U.S. developers who have the devs over their house, and they're all developing out of there. And there's a few things that are, so they're almost all amazingly similar in a lot of ways, and then not. And they're amazingly similar of that developers talk to each other a lot, and that they have a lot of conversations, so they share the knowledge of what's going on. Like almost every podcast is going to have somebody from like Barcelona and, you know, like London and US and Helsinki, and like there's all of these places that have games being made, and they talk about it and they share about it, and we all learn from each other, and everybody optimizes, right? If you think about min-maxing in a game, developers do that as well, right? So that kind of knowledge gets shared. What really dictates what kind of happens in the process is what you're making and kind of your tools available. So sometimes if you have a really strong leader, and like if you're Ken Levine, how you're making your game is how Ken Levine makes games, right? He is going to go off, and for good or for bad, he is going to go make games the way he makes them. And he does that because that's what he's been doing. That's where he's found success, right? I think there's other often very outspoken people who kind of do the same thing, because they're advocates for making games that way. And it doesn't make a difference. But like, if you look at like things like Genshin Impact being made, that almost has to be made in China for the amount of content they're creating, right? There's so much content. Now in the US, let's argue Apex Legends just makes a ton of content. Fortnite makes a bunch of content, but they're using studios around the world to do that. I'm going to say something here, and then I'm going to point out why people get mad. Developers in the West, particularly in the US, get paid a lot of money. Now, the moment I say that, a bunch of people are going to be angry at me, like, no, they're not. You go to games when you want to lose money. No, actually, developers in the United States get paid a good amount of money. If you're saying that, you're probably also the same person telling me how you should be using Linux for development, and I'm a loser because I'm not using open source tools and all of that. Yeah, you go fight that fight. That is a cool fight. I appreciate you fighting that fight. But if you just join the team and kind of go with the flow, you can make a lot of money in game development, and a lot of people have. I have. And it's unequal, for sure. Little indie devs aren't going to pay as much, and like there was a real, pre-COVID, there was a real acceleration of salaries that was unsustainable and have now gone back down. That's another thing I see a lot of. I see a lot of more senior people being like, well, I want the salary from 5 years ago, and that the salary just doesn't exist anymore. That's come back down to more reasonable levels. When we were hiring, we had people saying, hey, I could go to Meta and get paid $1 million. And I'm like, go there, sell your soul, I don't care. But we're not gonna pay you $1 million, right? So that influences kind of what you make and how you approach it. Do you have a bunch of students? So now I have seen people who have a bunch of students who don't take the time to mentor them, and they just burn them out and use them. That sucks. My friend Ryan Payton from Camouflage just recently won an award at the Game Awards for their VR game, and he often hired straight out of school, but they took the time to understand with who they were hiring and work with them, right? And so then they could do that. And so it's a lot of just that kind of thing of like, what are your resources available? Like I look to my next game and I go, well, do I really want to run a studio again, or do I just want to make games? And if I just want to make games, how do I do that? And I really like people in the community. How do we do that together? And I've been rethinking a lot of things. I don't know, right? But then you have Ubisoft. So my friends go to Ubisoft. They're going to make a big AAA game there, and they're all excited because hey, they're going to finally, they've got the wallets open. They can make a big giant thing, and they all end up just managing studios because other studios are actually making the game, and they're the heads of it, pulling it together. And they're in Canada, but it's a French company, right? So, and they're using Croatian developers. Like it's really a mix like that. And so it really is people optimize for finding the lowest price that they can get work done when work is just work, right? I think we've seen some games that happen when you don't have the skill set and I think maybe just the experience of doing it, you get some, let's say, pirate warship games that aren't very good, but yet get a lot of money to be made. But that could happen anywhere. And I think everybody struggles all the way around I've never met a head of a studio that made it all about how rich they can get and cash out. It's always been about how can we set this in an equitable way where the people actually doing the work are getting compensated well, but yet we are able to continue the studio forward. It is almost a conversations like that. You'd be shocked of like the big companies that have these conversations and try to figure that out where you think they're just money grubbing crazy people. It's just really hard to keep something afloat and going. And so, that's worldwide. I've gone to studios in China that are big, that have a bunch of people that I should talk about the time. Oh, I'm a bad consultant sometimes. But yeah, but also there's scrappy studios there of people that are branching off and trying things, right? And it just doesn't really, it's really so individual to the person. And we have this shared knowledge base, and then it's about the money and the costs and the location and the funding, and all of that makes way bigger difference than kind of of where you're located. I mean, Stalker 2 got made during a war while their country is being attacked. Like, all right, how do we rank that or think of that for other people making games, right? And so I think that's one of the cool things and things I really like about the game industry is I can go, hey, if I'm going to go to Copenhagen, I'm going to go hang out with friends who are friends, who I've talked with, who we've talked about making things together and doing things. Or if I'm going to go down to San Francisco, I'm not going to go to GDC to go to GDC. I'm going to go see friends. I can go to a whole bunch of different places around the world, and there's people I've had these conversations with, and we've had them as human beings talking about how do we make this work and how do we make this work in a way that makes sense. And it's a repeated conversation. And I don't know. Sometimes I think we're no better off at it now, and then someone will get lucky. And you know that, though, right? So that's when someone's like, oh, well, everyone should just make it like Bolatro, right? That guy was great. Who he is. Really good podcast, the EAS podcast with him. A lot of respect for him. And not showing up at the awards. That is my way to accept an award. Yeah. But, like, sure, we should all do that. Like, no, right? And so, yeah, it does. It's less to do with the country and there. And then also these follow up on here about players. And I think you can see that of different regions already of where people play and what they play. And, can MOBAs work in the West or do they need to be in the East? That's a question I'm going to talk about a certain game that I want to discuss. But yeah, there you go. Again, I am long-winded. See if this microphone works up here. It looks weird. I don't know. I got to figure this out. I think I can sit back as far as I want. I gotta suck on my gut then. Like that. I have a printer on display. I don't actually use it. That's my old computer. I still keep it here because I don't know. Maybe I'm gonna need it. Maybe there's something on there. Like every once in a while, I need to look up some kind of like profile thing.